Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your invitation, your introduction, Desley, and to the Society, thank you for your invitation to address you today on the subject of new Farm Anzacs. There are 267 names on the honour boards in the Merrington Chapel at St Andrew's Uniting Church in the city. They were just names, and people wondered who they were. We managed to research the lives of all of them, and then to write their life stories, their childhood, the schools they attended, military service, and then for most of them, their return to Australia and the occupations they followed in civilian life. Of the 267 names, 55 died during the war. Then there were those who died back here in Australia because of the effects of their war service. Nearly all the stories of the men and women whose names are on the honour boards include descriptions of their times in hospitals. They tell of bouts of illness or injuries as a result of serious gunshot wounds or gassing or heat exhaustion. We learnt a lot by carrying out our research project. We learnt about the theatres of war: Gallipoli in Turkey, France and Belgium, Egypt and the Middle East. We learnt about how the war affected homes and families back at home in Australia. We met the relatives of some of the men and women whose names are on the boards. And that led to making lots of connections and discoveries. Some of them had kept photos and letters and medals. One of the satisfying things about research is how much you learn. On the boards, there are at least 20 names of soldiers who lived here in New Farm. We found out their dates and places of birth, where they went to school, their occupations, their fathers' occupations, their part in the war, and so on. There was a degree of similarity. Most of, for example, trained at Enoggera Camp before going overseas on board a troop ship, usually from Brisbane. In 1914 and 1915, most ships went to Egypt. After the withdrawal from Gallipoli in December 1915, the troop ships went mainly to English and Scottish ports. And most of the soldiers didn't come home until the year 1919 or even 1920 for discharge from the AIF here in Brisbane. A month ago, Dr. Mark Cryle spoke of the origins of Anzac Day. His address helped us to understand the many ideas that were developing in Australia at that time. He spoke of the complexity of opinions about the war. He also pointed out the influence of the churches and the leadership of the clergy. Our research certainly helped us understand how two churches in the city of Brisbane influenced the lives of 267 men and women at the time of the Great War. The honour boards come from two churches in the city: St Andrew's, Presbyterian at that time, and Wharf Street, Congregational. They both became uniting churches in 1977 and amalgamated in 1981. That's why the honour boards of both churches are now at St Andrew's Uniting Church. Today I'd like to divide the rest of my talk into three parts. I'll say something about these two historic churches because both have interesting connections with the suburb of New Farm. Secondly, we'll look at what we learnt about some of the soldiers who lived here in the suburb of New Farm. And then tomorrow, being Anzac Day, I'd like to finish with a tribute to the lives of these courageous people. St Andrew's Church stands on the corner of Creek and Ann Streets. The honour boards are in one of the transepts. It's called the Merrington Anzac Memorial Peace Chapel. On the wall on the left, I'll show you these more closely, are the booklets. They were written about the lives of the soldiers. See the flags of the services level with the windows, a candle on the table, a photograph of Chaplain Merrington conducting a communion service on the right-hand wall. I'll show you that more closely in a moment. The communion vessels that the Reverend Merrington used are displayed. Padre Merrington was the minister at St Andrews. This is the photograph of the communion service. Dr. Merrington kept diaries and later used them to write his memoirs. He wrote about this particular phase in his life. I obtained permission to hold the first church service in the valley on the Gallipoli Peninsula. It was held in Monash Gully, just north of Pope's Post and in front of the medical aid post. No singing was allowed by order of the brigadier. It was strange indeed to be speaking amid the sounds of firing, punctuating one's words. Sometimes a bomb would whiz close by with a loud burst. On one such occasion, the whole squatting congregation leaned sideways, hearing the approaching missile, which buried itself in the other bank of the gully. Padre Merrington served loyalty during the Great War. A remarkably capable man with high academic qualifications, patriotic, compassionate, and hard-working. He was on the first Australian ship departing Albany in 1914. He went at first to Gallipoli, then to Egypt and then Gallipoli, and returned to Australia just before the withdrawal in December, suffering badly with malaria. After 2 very busy years, the Reverend Merrington returned to the Western Front in 1918 and worked from the Australian depot at Le Havre. Here is a closer look at the booklets that were written about the individual soldiers. In most cases, we found a photograph for the front cover, and that made it live a little bit more after we'd found out so much about that person's life. There were several instances where brothers served, so we put them together in the one booklet, sometimes 2 or 3 or even 4 from the one family. And that's just one sample of a booklet that we prepared. 2 of the honour boards in the Merrington Chapel come from the Wharf Street Congregational Church. It stood on the corner of Wharf Street and Adelaide Street. Many of its worshippers lived here in New Farm. Wharf Street's long-serving minister was the Reverend Edward Griffith. He was the minister there for a period of 29 years. Edward and his wife Mary had 2 sons and 6 daughters, and you've heard of this family before, of course. The eldest son, Edward, was the manager of the Royal Bank and lived in Moray Street, and his second son was Sir Samuel, and he lived at Merthyr, as you know, in New Farm. One of their daughters, Alice, married a well-known accountant named Henry Oxley, whose house was Moss Lee at the north corner of Bowen Terrace and Langshaw Street. And that brings us to the first 2 new Farm Anzacs that I'd like to mention today. Alric Griffith Oxley and Leolf Griffith Oxley, sons of Henry and Alice Oxley, nephews of the Queensland Premier, Sir Samuel Griffith. Alric and Leolf were both born at Mossley. Their father, Henry, was a community worker and finance company director. Alric attended Brisbane Grammar, sat the junior examination and passed in French and Latin and Greek and algebra. That's an interesting combination. Alric's war service is interesting. As a member of the Australian Army Medical Corps, he spent 4 years tending sick, wounded and dying soldiers, mostly at Kantara, a port on the Suez Canal. It was the site of the headquarters of the Eastern Force during the defence of the Suez Canal. When Sergeant Oxley was discharged in 1919, his medical report said, "No wounds or disabilities." For his war service, he was awarded 3 medals, and this was quite common: the 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal. Alric's younger brother, Leolf, also served in the AIF. His war service took place entirely in England, in convalescence camps, field ambulance depots and Australian Medical Corps training camps. He worked from Herdcott House, the headquarters of No. 3 Command Depot of the Australian Infantry Forces. The depot received men who had been evacuated sick or wounded from France and were reckoned likely to become fit for active service again within 3 months. And another speciality of Herdcott House was that it paid particular attention to dental health. A man needing to have 10 sound teeth in each jaw to be past fit for overseas training, so that he could hold the mouth of his gas helmet properly. Back in Australia, in civilian life, Leolf became known as Jack Oxley. He died in Stanthorpe at the age of 44. There are many interesting stories to be told about Martha Burns. She lived with her mother and the rest of her family in the house called Hope Mansell on the corner of Villiers and Brunswick Streets. Martha Burns was an exceptional woman who achieved a lot in her lifetime. She trained as a nurse in the Brisbane Hospital and later became a dentist, the first female dentist in Queensland. "I had no intention of becoming a lady driving out in the buggy, visiting and taking tea," she said. Martha had become a nurse in 1900 and by then her two elder sisters had been launched into society. According to the custom of the day, they came out at private balls held in the drawing room of the family home in Villiers Street, against a romantic and gracious background of string music. There just didn't seem to be a niche for me at all, Martha said. So she sided with her brother, played whist and tennis, galloped and jumped her horse, and in 1907, the year she graduated as a dentist, she completed her disregard for hidebound feminine restrictions by buying a car. It was a chain-driven, one-cylinder, 7-horsepower Oldsmobile, which she drove furiously up and down the street at 16 miles per hour. Martha opened her first dental surgery on the second floor of the AMP building on the corner of Queen and Edward Streets. She held many meetings there with professional people in the city. She was in London attending a dental congress in 1914 when the war started. And so she offered her services to the War Office. First of all as a nurse, because she did hold a certificate of training from the Brisbane General Hospital. She was told there were so many prior applications she would have little or no chance. Oh, well, she said, I have a dentist's diploma and I might be useful in that capacity. Also, she added, I have a permit to act as a competent chauffeur, so if I am rejected as a nurse and a dentist, I might be accepted as a motor deliverer. Oh, you're the sort of woman we want at the front, she was told, and so they accepted her at once. So Sister Martha Burns joined the Australian Voluntary Hospital, sailed across the Channel and worked long, strenuous hours in the hospital at Saint-Nazaire in France. I wish I had time to tell you more stories of Martha Burns. You can read all the biographies we wrote about the 267 men and women on the honour boards online. So I'll give you its web address before we finish. So far then, we've mentioned 3 people, all of whom served in the Great War, tending the sick and the wounded and the dying. The next 3 are sons of prominent Brisbane families. One was engaged in action at Gallipoli. All 3 fought in France, and all three spent time as patients this time in hospitals. Cyril Carvosso's father served as Supreme Court Sheriff in Queensland, was a renowned cricketer and cricket umpire for interstate matches. Mrs. Carvosso was president, that's Cyril's mother, was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union for a period of 30 years. Their home was in Arthur Street. Before Cyril enlisted in the AIF, he completed his examinations with honours to become an optometrist. While I was preparing Cyril's story, I met Cyril's daughter, Helen, and she gave me these 3 photos, their home in Arthur Street, his visit to the home of Cecil Rhodes when his ship called at Cape Town, and Private Carvosso in hospital uniform in an English hospital. I remember turning over that particular photo, and he had written for his family's sake, "What do you think of this?" He spent quite some time in hospital during his months on the Western Front, suffering wounding of his hand while in action, and a disease called trench feet, a condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to the damp and unsanitary and cold conditions in the muddy war trenches of France. After the war, there was a long wait for many soldiers to get back to Australia, as I've said. There was a scheme called non-military employment, whereby soldiers could gain experience in their occupational field. In the case of Cyril Carvosso, he studied at the British Optical Institute in London, gaining the fellowship of the British Optical Association and the freemanship of the Spectacle Makers Union, and becoming a freeman of the City of London. And on his return to Australia, he used these qualifications to his advantage by including them in his advertisements. I read in the Western Star, or the Roma Western Star, that Cyril Carvosso was a free man of the City of London. I'm sure that would impress the people of Roma. Cyril's daughter told me that her father came home on a ship that carried the Australian Prime Minister at that time, Billy Hughes, and the Minister for the Navy, Sir Joseph Cook. Another young man was Stuart Gower. His father was R.M. Gower, businessman, merchant, company director, R.M. Gower and Company Limited, a highly successful firm specialising in the wholesale merchandising of foods and household requisites, including a cordial bottle. Stuart had 3 younger brothers, and their family home was Gowan Bray in Mark Street, across there, on the corner of Mark Street and Mountford Street. He was only 20 when he enlisted in the AIF, and he became a driver in the motor transport section of the Australian Army Service Corps. An offence was recorded against driver Gower for being absent without leave while travelling by train when not in possession of a leave pass. He was confined to barracks for 7 days and forfeited 1 day's pay. And when Stuart Gower married on his return to Australia, the bridegroom's gift to the bride was a single-seater sports car. The names of Lieutenant Walter S. McTaggart and Lieutenant Eric McTaggart are printed on one of the honour boards. Walter was the oldest and Eric the youngest in the family of Daniel and Florence McTaggart. The 4 in between were girls. The father, Daniel McTaggart, was a pioneer in the beef fattening industry, and he set up the stock and station agency which still bears its name, McTaggart's. Walter and Eric survived their service on the Western Front, though both suffered the harmful effects of gassing. Let me say 2 or 3 things about the elder son, Sir Walter Scipio McTaggart. Walter was a very early enlistment in the AIF. As you know, they all received a unique regimental number. And in the case of Walter, it was number 6 in the Australian Imperial Force. He joined the 9th Battalion in August 1914 here in Brisbane, and he was promoted to the rank of sergeant a week later. And he sailed from Brisbane on the Omra, the same ship that Padre Merrington was on in September 1914. And he served in Gallipoli, France and Belgium. Before the Gallipoli campaign, the Australian troops trained in Egypt, and this well-known picture was taken during that time. An Australian soldier with the famous pyramids in the background. The soldier with the wallaby was Walter Scipio McTaggart, and the photographer was Padre Merrington. They were interesting discoveries in our research. The names of 3 Rankin brothers are on the boards. Their father was Robert Alexander Rankin, a Brisbane City Council alderman and gentleman of independent means. And his father was Robert Alexander Rankin too, and he was co-founder of the confectionery firm Rankin and Morrow, a well-known Brisbane business. The mother of the 3 Rankin brothers was Jessie, and after her husband's sudden death in 1908, Jessie lived in Merthyr Road. Her house was on the corner of Merthyr Road and Russell Street. I took a while to find Russell Street, but it changed its name to Alfred Street, so it's on that corner. Merthyr Road and Alfred Street. Jessie's 3 sons, George, Ben and Charles, all joined the army. All went to the Western Front, where they were very ill and injured, gunshot wounding, gas poisoning. All spent a lot of time in 1916, 1917 and 1918 in hospitals in England. George was the eldest. He was 40 when he enlisted. He lived with his wife and family on the corner of Wellsby Street and Russell Street. The Rankin boys' occupations are interesting. George was a confectioner. Ben had been a clerk and a labourer before he enlisted. And Charles had worked as a coffee roaster and a bridge painter. They all had a long wait in England before returning to Brisbane to be discharged. I thought of George's wife with the children and their mother, Jessie, in Merthyr Road, and the anxious time they would have experienced while the 3 boys were away. The name of George Wilcox is on one of the honour boards. As you can see, Army Major, Order of the British Empire, Military Cross, Bachelor of Medicine, Master of Surgery from the University of Sydney in 1913, before the war, member of the Royal College of Physicians and Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians after the war. His non-military experience was in hospitals, and that's where he gained those memberships in the College of Physicians. George was the eldest son of George and Mary Ann Wilcox. Their father, George, was a railway contractor and supervised the building of tram tracks in George Street. And their home was Wynberg in Brunswick Street. While a medical officer in the Great War, he was mentioned in dispatches and awarded the Military Cross. And the citation reads, for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. He worked continuously for about 16 hours in the open, under fire, and successfully evacuated a large number of wounded men. He set a splendid example of courage and determination. Tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, will be Anzac Day. Tributes will be paid all over Australia and New Zealand. There were many from New Farm who paid the supreme sacrifice. And here are 5 young men whose names are on the honour boards at St Andrews who did not return. Kenneth Banks was an orphan from the age of 7 and was cared for by his aunt in Annie Street. After serving at Quinn's Post, Gallipoli, in 1915, Kenneth became ill and unfit for service and was transported back home. He re-enlisted in 1918. On the way back to the war, on board the ship to the Western Front, he suffered a heart attack and died. He was buried at sea. Kenneth's name is on the Hollybrook Memorial at Southampton in Hampshire, amongst the almost 1,900 Commonwealth servicemen and women who have no known grave. The Shields brothers, Donald and Charles, lived with their parents in Sargent Road, New Farm, now Sargent Street. Donald needed his parents' permission when he joined the AIF, as he was only 19. Both father and mother had to sign. Alfred is the father and Harriet the mother. They both signed. He trained at Enoggera and Egypt before entering the trenches of the Western Front in January 1916, but was killed in action just weeks later near Armentières in France. He was only 20. His grave is at Bailleul in France. He was struck by shrapnel and died of his wounds. His brother Charles was 7 years older than Donald. He enlisted and participated in the very first landing of Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. He was very ill, but he did survive and later served on the Western Front in France and Belgium, where he died from a self-inflicted bullet in 1917. His grave is at Trois Arbres Cemetery in France. A package came in the mail containing testament, pocketbook, knife, letter and photos, and that was delivered to the Shields home in Sargent Street. Mr. and Mrs. Shields received another letter requesting their preferences for inscriptions on their lost sons' gravestones. Mrs. Harriet Shields again wrote, "You may put the cross of the Christian faith, and greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." The Walthall family, they lived in Leckmere Street. They were involved in the Sunday school at the St Andrew's Church, and they received news that their son Bill was killed in action at Bullecourt on the 3rd or 4th of May 1917. William Howard Walthall has no known grave. Along with thousands of other Australians killed in France and who have no known grave, his name is remembered with honour at the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial in France. And his name is on the memorial at New Farm State School. Graham Wareham's mother and father and sister lived on the corner of Brunswick Street and Morton Street. Mr. Wareham was the CEO of the Adelaide Steamship Company. Graham was a Sunday school teacher, a men's group secretary at St Andrews, and he was killed in action at Quinn's Post just a few days after landing on Gallipoli Peninsula in May 1915. He has no known grave, and his name is engraved on the memorial at Lone Pine on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The 5 soldiers whom I've just mentioned will be remembered at Anzac Day service here at Merthyr Road Uniting Church tomorrow afternoon. Each one will be represented by a silhouette in front of us. Their names are on those silhouettes. The 5 silhouettes will occupy seats scattered in the congregation. And as they are named and a little said about each, a sprig of rosemary will be placed on their chair. They all lived here in New Farm and now are not here, yet they are remembered and honoured. Thank you for your interest in our research project. The booklets about the soldiers would amount to volumes if combined. It has been a privilege to be able to share with you today just a small fraction of our findings. All the booklets are available for people to read online. The website is Lives, Links and Legacy, and there's the web address. It'll remain on the screen for a moment if you'd like to note it. Thank you.
Don't go away. Wow, what do we say about that? The preparation was flawless. I still don't know how the slides moved because I didn't see anything. But it's just, it was an honour to listen to that. So clear, crisp, and the structure was beautiful. And to think that you specially chose those people associated in our neighbourhood. And we note that and very thankful because somehow or other there's a feeling of connectedness when we recognise the name of a street that we may walk past every day, or even a house that we know. So it really was quite touching and beautifully presented, and I could have listened to so much more. But we've got a book about homes of history that we'd like to present to you. Can we give Noel another round of applause? Would anyone like to ask any questions before we let Noel go? So why were the names put on an honour board in a church? Noel? Is that a normal practice? I've seen them in bowls clubs, I've seen them on monuments. Why would they have been in a church?
As we said, the clergy had a leading role at that time, and they did appreciate the sacrifice that their young men and women made, and they wanted to honour them in the church community, and that applied in the cities throughout and country areas throughout Australia at that time. I think perhaps they were also influenced by Padre Merrington, who often visited the Enoggera camp before the war.
And who made these silhouettes?
There's the man over there. His name is Fred Black.
Hey, Fred.
And
Well done.
we're greatly indebted to him.
There's another question here.
How many years did all your research take, and were other people involved?
We began in 2014 and finished by Remembrance Day 2018. So it was throughout the commemorative period of the centenary of the Great War. Yes, there were helpers. I did a few of the research projects, and others learnt the technique as well, and they also contributed. There was a team of us.
Yes?
No, I want to ask you, it's a subject that's happening just now. Did the Spanish flu restrict any movement of personnel back to Australia? Was any restriction because of the Spanish flu at that time? It was 1918, wasn't it? Were they restricted in any way getting back in, or did they?
Yes, they were delayed because of it.
Okay.
And there were outbreaks of the Spanish flu on board the ships as they returned. Yes.
One more.
Would Noel give us a short summary of the connection between the Merthyr Road Church and St Andrew's Church?
That's a whole nother talk. He's done an amazing research project on that as well, and it's a fascinating history. I would recommend it's a whole afternoon again.
Yes, this very hall and kitchen over there were used for the first Meals on Wheels in Brisbane, served from St Andrew's Presbyterian Church in 1960. So that's a very obvious connection. Another is that when St Andrews was built in 1905, there was an architect's competition for a suitable design. And the architect in charge of the competition and who had a leading role in judging it was Claude Chambers, who lived at 52 Merthyr Road, New Farm, in a house called Oakley. So there are a couple of connections, Graham.
Oh, this will be a hard question from Gerard. He's a historian.
In order to track down the descendants of the people, did you spend a lot of time on the phone and going through the phone book?
No. Mainly, Ancestry is a family history site, as you know, and it helped me. And I often contacted the families in order to learn more about the descendants. It was very helpful to be able to talk to a son or daughter or nephew.
And the last one?
Noel, you're too modest. You haven't mentioned your own medals and your own service history. Are you happy to tell us about your own background?
Thank you, yes. I served as a national serviceman in 1955. Yes, 1955, the January intake of 1955, and then served for 2 years after that. The national service scheme finished, and 50 years later medals were available for those who had served. So, and the other one is the OAM for the services to the community through the Uniting Church in Australia.
I think the lady behind looks eager.
Yes, it was just, you said it would be volumes if it was published. And are there any plans to publish any of the stories, or is it just going to stay online? There are two Campbell relatives of mine on the St Andrews honour board.
Yes, well, they are displayed in the chapel, and the booklets are all there. So that's the extent of the publishing at this stage. We did do one set. We bound one set, and there were 8 volumes, about that thick, a lovely binding job. And that was a gift for Nola, who's sitting in the back, and who kindly put all the booklets together for us, published them, and prepared today's slides. And I think we owe to her our thanks.
Yes. Thank you,
Thank you, Desley.
Denise.
Denise, sorry.
Desley's getting some afternoon tea ready for us.